Okay.
There you go.
So why don't we begin with just a little prayer? We'll have a scripture reading. Would anybody mind reading? It's going to be Luke chapter 10, verse 25 through 37.
I don't have it.
I'll
Does
read.
anybody have-
You'll read it, Jenny?
Anybody else? Yes.
Okay, Jenny, you'll read it. Okay. So we'll start and then we'll cue you when to read, okay?
Okay.
So we'll begin by lighting the candle as we normally do. Have yours with you.
God of wisdom, you are the Alpha and the Omega, God of all that is. You knew us before we were born. You have counted every hair on our heads.
God of knowledge, impart your wisdom unto us today. Speak to us through our guest, LeBrian, through readings and videos, and through one another. Amen.
Repeat after me as we prepare for our scripture reading. Speak to us, Holy One.
Speak to us, Holy One, through your living word.
Through your
Living word. May these words speak to our lives.
May these words speak to our lives
and shape our words and deeds.
And shape our words and deeds.
And now let us listen to the scripture from Luke, chapter 10, 25 to 37.
On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? What is written in the law? He replied. How do you read it? He answered, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. You have answered correctly, Jesus replied. Do this and you will live. But he wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? In reply, Jesus said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. "Look after him," he said, "and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have." Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? The expert in the law replied, "The one who had mercy on him." Jesus told him, "Go and do likewise."
Samaritans were despised because of their ethnicity and religious practices. Yet in this passage, it is the Samaritan who models love of neighbor. In your own life, have you ever received help or compassion from someone you didn't like or were afraid of?
It would have been against religious law for the Samaritan to touch the man on the side of the road. Throughout history, advocates for change have broken unjust laws, societal norms, and religious codes in order to seek justice, and they have often suffered the consequences. Who inspires you to take a risk for justice? Let us say their names aloud as we give thanks for their lives and witnesses.
Carol,
Linda,
James,
Lily,
Emily,
Tutu,
Martin,
Mike, okay, so if no one else wants to add anything to that, we're going to read together a pledge to rescue our youth, which is found in attachment A. It was written by Maya Angelou. So if we all get out that attachment A. A pledge to rescue our youth. So I think we'll just do this together. Young women, young men of color, We add our voices to the voices of your ancestors who speak to you over ancient seas and across impossible mountain tops. Okay, so Thomas, we're going to, oh, I'm sorry. Okay, so I'm gonna appoint people to go ahead and read the rest of it. Sissy, can you read the next one?
Come up from the gloom of national neglect. You have already been paid for. Come out of the shadow of irrational prejudice. You owe no racial debt to history.
Carrie?
The blood of our bodies and the prayers of our souls have bought you a future free from shame and bright beyond the telling of it.
Jenny? Jenny, you're on mute.
Sorry. We pledge ourselves and our resources to seek for you clean and well-furnished schools, safe and non-threatening streets, employment which makes use of your talents but does not degrade your dignity.
Thomas?
You are the best we have. You are all we have. You are what we have become.
We pledge
You.
you our whole hearts from this day forward.
So, we welcome you, LeBrian, and thank you for agreeing to share with us some of your story. And so I guess, I sent you a few things just to think about in terms of what you wanted to say. So I'm kind of just going to hand it over to you and let you go with it, whatever you feel like you want to share with us about your story, your work, the things that are important to you.
All right, thank you. So I think I know almost everybody. I don't necessarily know Miss Carrie there, but I am glad to see you. I don't know how much you all know about what I usually do, but I teach. I've been teaching for, this is year number 11, almost 12 years now. And most of the stuff that I teach are around the uncomfortable topics of race, ethnicity, sexuality, gender inequality, all sorts of stuff like that. So like have the uncomfortable conversations that people don't like to have all the time, which is, it's usually fun, but every once in a while we have problematic moments, or should I call them passionate and exciting moments in the classroom. But that's my primary job. Outside of that, of course, most people probably know that I dance outside of that. Not so much right now. So, but in the simplest form, I usually like to just call myself a teacher, but my technical job is a professor. But I like to let my students know that I'm just there to guide the way that they think. You know, I don't necessarily teach them or give them the answers to problems. I usually just help them learn how to understand them. And I let them know from the beginning of my courses that I'm not there to change their minds. I'm just there to open their minds, that there are other ways of thinking, other ways of doing things in the world. So I guess that's the primary nuts and bolts of what I actually do. Why I do that stuff, it's a funny story, and people usually laugh when I tell them that I used to not like people very much when I was growing up. I didn't always have people be the kindest to me as I was growing up, and I told my mom I didn't really like them. And she said, yes, you do. And I said, no, I don't. So I decided to go to school to understand people, or really to understand why I didn't like them. But as I began to learn more and more about them, it wasn't that I didn't like them. I started to just be amazed by some of the things that they were doing. And that could go either direction, in a good way or a bad way, but I just began to be amazed. But I started to understand why people do what they do, probably sometimes to my detriment, to where it makes it difficult to watch people do what they do without understanding why they're doing what they're doing, if that makes sense. Probably sounds complicated, but sometimes we do things because we don't know any other way of doing them. We've learned this is how we should operate, this is how people around us should operate, or certain people should operate. So therefore we have an expectation that this is how they're going to operate. And we come to our different situations, different social situations with that same expectation. I say expectations, you might hear bias, whether it's implicit or an explicit bias. There's still expectations on how people should behave. And when they step out of that, normally it takes us a moment. Sometimes we take those moments with fear. We take those moments by surprise. Some of us sit and we actually try to learn from what we're seeing that's different from what it is that we expected to happen in that moment. So that's the primary reason why, is because I had to understand why people did what they did. But in the process of learning these things, I also unlearned a lot of my own upbringing. And what I mean by that, I unlearned a lot of the prejudices that I may have been groomed or socialized to understand how the world operated. And that's not just coming from like my immediate family, but that's from watching television, listening to music, listening to the radio, all sorts of things, seeing things in a newspaper. All of these things were sort of agents of socialization for me. So they taught me how the world operated. But one thing that education has done was sort of, I would say, muddy the waters when it comes to the knowledge that I should know as I developed, you know. So it sort of created that gray area. It created that rational way of thinking about the world, as opposed to a traditional mind that we usually come to our adulthood with. And by tradition, I'm specifically talking about the traditions of your own household, not necessarily the traditions of a particular culture or a nation, depending on how involved your family is in that, or integrated into that culture. That's just my history into getting into teaching and why I remained as a teacher, which I really, really love doing. You all threw me a question where it said, why is racial justice important to me, as well as my vocation? I thought that was probably the hardest question that you all threw, but it wasn't necessarily difficult. The hard part that I would say is that most of us don't actually understand the difference between things like equity and equality and how those things are tied to racial justice. We also don't necessarily look in the mirror. And if we look in the mirror, one of the things we might see is the history that we have, or the history that our culture has endured for a long time. And not just our culture, but there are plenty of cultures around the world that also deal with racial equity and injustice issues as well. But teaching courses about race, teaching courses about criminology, the criminal justice system, all of those courses do is contextualize knowledge. You know, I'm not changing history, I'm contextualizing what we know about a particular time period and how that impacted people at that time, and how it continues to impact people beyond that time. A lot of us try to create sort of a quick fix. You know, here's an issue, and this is the easy way to solve it. But if we don't actually understand the root cause of that issue or the history around that issue, then all we're doing is just putting a bandage on something that may create a problem that was worse than that was there prior to us sort of creating this new solution. So I try to teach my students how to understand the history or the context of an issue in order to sort of develop solutions for that issue, instead of seeing, you know, even if we think about the racial tension and climate that we have right now, we have so many people that are coming down on police officers. While I'm not condoning the behavior of police, we don't necessarily look at how police officers are not the only problem that we have. We have other issues that are sort of in our society, and the police are evidence of those issues being present. You know, before police are police, they are people. They are people that are socialized in this society that has this long history of, and I guess I should put it into this context that things like the Black Lives Matter movement, or even all these protests that we have going on, they're against whiteness, not necessarily white people, and most people don't distinguish between those two different things. Whiteness is not just associated with white people. It is associated with an entire culture that has been socialized to understand that white is good, and the darker your skin color, the worse you are. It creates this idea or this image of fear when you see dark complexions. The police are an example of that fear manifesting into a reality. But that fear doesn't just come from, a black body being on the receiving end of a bullet. It also comes from a person walking down the street, maybe clutching their purse when they see a black person, or the black person that may be a professional, but they walk by a car and immediately hear that those automatic locks go down, and they're just trying to go home. Or the fear of a person who looks like me walking down the street, but I see someone that is coming to me that is a white person, or in particularly a white woman, and I cross the street just to get somewhere that's right actually on the other side of her. Why did I do that? Because I've also been socialized in a culture that understands that a person that looks like me might create fear in someone who looks total opposite of me, right? So that's what we mean by sort of tackling whiteness, but not necessarily tackling white people, because white people are not the only ones that are impacted by that. For example, if any of you have been to Arizona, there are not many black people at all. I'm the only black professor in my department, and many times I'm the only black person in my classroom, and that includes my students. I am the only one. I had a student this year tell me I was the first black teacher that he's ever had in his life, and I am a college professor, so that means K through 12 was not racially diverse. So being in this sphere, I face a lot of things at work, being afraid to speak up sometimes, because speaking up could cause more issues. It could cause me to make the situation uncomfortable because I disagree with the way that someone else, the solution that someone else is proposing. But if you are a college educator, the idea behind that is that you are a creative thinker. That means you also are a critical thinker. That means that we're going to have differences of opinions, but someone who looks like me cannot always express those opinions or express the knowledge that we might bring to the table because we have a different experience, without creating tension in that situation. So all of those things come from an idea that white is right and everything else would be incorrect. And what I mean by that, slaves could not disobey their masters. They could not go against their masters. They couldn't do anything. If they had to say something, then that could result in them possibly dying, being whipped, or punished in some kind of other way. The same things happen, but they happen in different manners in our everyday life that we don't always recognize. But without recognizing that, or taking a moment to say, why do I feel that what this person said was hostile? If they just disagreed with me, did they have an attitude? And even if you think that they did have an attitude, what do you understand about the culture of that particular group of people and how they may speak? Because each group, we do speak differently. Some of us, we may sound more emphatic when we speak, and that might sound like aggression to some people. Disagreement can simply sound like aggression. We don't always usually say, what is it about me or how I might perceive this person that might cause me to take what they're saying in a way that might create an anxiety or a tension or a fear in my body, that I respond to them in a different way. That usually comes from a bias that we can't always tell. Those implicit biases that are there, we don't know that they're there usually until they come out. And if someone brings up that they have an issue, it usually can create more trouble for us. So as an educator, I continue to try to help my students see those things. I have them take implicit bias tests, and many of them don't like the results, especially when the results don't yield what they thought they were. And I have to let them know implicit means that we will not know that it's there, you know. But now that we are aware that it possibly could be there, then we would take more care when we are in the presence of someone who we potentially might have a bias against. So I always try to help them understand those kinds of things, but I don't want them to ever feel like my opinion is the end all. And I let them know that as well. I should learn something in the classroom from them as my students as they are learning from me. You know, they're not passive recipients of knowledge. They are people who experience the world as well. So all of the theories and everything that I'm talking about in those classes, I usually let them know you have your own experience. You are a body of knowledge. So therefore, how I'm speaking about this knowledge, you should be able to contribute to this, because I can only understand the world as a Black man. I can understand the world as a Black man who's learned about the lives of other people. However, I am simply what I am. So therefore, my perception of this might be different from yours. So when we're talking about these things, I like to encourage that dialogue that people don't usually get, which is why we have a lot of tensions, is that we don't teach civil discourse. We don't teach people how to speak to people who may have a difference of opinion from them in a civil manner without wanting to fight them. You know, we have a world that is surrounded by social media now and all of these different kind of internet algorithms to where you see knowledge that fits your train of thought. You can easily block things that don't agree with you. You know, if someone doesn't agree with you, you can block them from your social media. My goal in the classroom, I don't just teach in the classroom, I also teach across campus trying to help teachers learn how to teach as well. My goal is for them to understand that just because a student may not agree with you, or your colleague may not agree with you, or talking to students and other students may not agree with you, or your professor may not agree with you, it doesn't mean that you have to fight with each other. But if you can sit down and have a conversation with that person and understand, or have the goal of trying to understand them rather than making them understand you. Because if you understood them, you might understand that you both are saying the same thing, you're just saying it in a different manner. So therefore, we can clarify and we can move forward. But if we don't agree, we can also say, okay, now I understand where you're coming from, and I can take that into consideration whenever I do approach this topic again, because I may approach someone else who thinks like you do. And it's not that either one of these ways are better than the other, they're just different from one another. So I teach them the value of respecting each other's opinions, even if those opinions are different, right? So that's sort of my whole spiel into getting into education, why I continue to do that, and why racial justice is important to my job. I know I mentioned equity versus equality, and feel free to just jump in here, because I'm not one of those people that I have to talk the whole time. You can jump in, unmute yourself, and if you have any questions or anything I say that pops in your head, definitely stop me, or it's questionable, right? But I don't teach equality, I teach equity. And I told I always ask them what's the difference between those things. And many of them don't always know, but I let them know equality says that everybody should have the same thing. And then I ask them, are we the same? And they say no. I said, so that means that what I may need may be different from someone else's. So I let them know you still have to pay attention to the differences between people in order to treat them fairly. So that's where I focus on equity. What do I need, or what does one classmate need that's different from another? And I try to provide that. You know, each semester with a new batch of students, I have to figure out what each student needs. I'm not going to treat all of my students the same way, and I let them know that from the beginning. I told them I will care in the same manner about each of them, but what I provide for them is not going to be the exact same thing that another classmate may get. And I think the same thing has to happen in our society, that we don't want to say, oh, well, we have to look at differences. We do. Most of us want to try to treat people equally. You know, when people say, oh, well, I don't see color, And I tell them that that's absolutely not something you should ever say to anyone, because then that lets me know that you don't actually care about the experiences that I have to go through every single day just to get here the same job that you do. So I let them know you have to focus on differences sometimes in order to be fair to everyone. You need to focus on those things. So understanding those differences will help you provide the equal access to things like education, things like job opportunities, or even interactions with the police. If the police actually understood how different groups of people in our society see them, if they understood the anxiety that can be created by that situation with the police, if they understood how different groups of people spoke, meaning what is aggressive to one group may not be aggressive to another group. Understanding those differences will ease the tensions that we have when we interact with one another. And that's one of the things that, as a teacher, we have to do all the time, because our students are very different from one another. And I have to know how this group interacts and how that group interacts. But I don't also generalize either, because even though you may belong to one group, it does not mean that your personality is going to be like everybody in that group. And many of us sort of do that, which is, it's a natural thing to do. We try to put people in a box. When we see them, we immediately kind of size them up and we say, okay, I need to interact with this person this way. We do that all the time, but I would say do that with caution. You have to allow people to show you. If they show you something that's different, take that in, because then you realize, even though all of these people have differences within one group, I will say the variation within a group is different. It's much greater than the variation between groups. And most of us don't focus on those similarities. Groups are more similar than they are different from one another. However, within the groups, there's a lot more variation. And we don't allow people to have that variation. Another question that you all threw at me was, how does faith inform the work that I do? I will say that faith is, okay, first of all, I grew up in a Pentecostal background. I don't know how many of you know that. It was a very strong Pentecostal family as well. They still are, that was a tough sort of upbringing, because it's a very strict religion for those that know much about it. Very strict religion. But my relationship as I matured in understanding spirituality and understanding religion and spiritual teachings, I would say what I do is sort of an arm of my spirituality and faith. And what I mean by that is not that I am going to act and behave differently in different situations, or should I say, I'm going to be okay with different things in those situations, because to me, that's a hypocrite. However, different situations call for different energies. So the same things that I may agree with in one situation, I'm also going to agree with those in a different situation. However, how you execute them may be very, very different, So for example, you all brought up actually one of the scriptures that sort of guides the way that I think about the world, and that is loving my neighbor like I love myself. Understanding that particular passage helped me sort of make peace with a lot of things that I may not always agree with in religion, which is the same thing with how I'm teaching. I don't always believe the same things that other people believe. However, I respect those beliefs, because I would want that same respect returned to me. So as I'm teaching people about differences in racial and ethnic backgrounds and ability status or sexual orientation, I always let them know you don't have to agree with the person, but you should respect that person in the same way that you would want them to respect your beliefs as well. So I had to make peace with a lot of the contradictions that I would say of my religious teachings. And while I'm not saying that that the Bible is full of lies, I always tell people I've learned to contextualize it. I realized that it was written in a particular time by a particular group of people and under particular circumstances. I look at it as a guide for understanding different situations in the world, but I also look at it as a conversation between God and people. You know, different people. It's not necessarily a monolithic script that has been written. It involves different groups of people, different persons, different fables from people of different backgrounds. So I've learned to use it as sort of a blueprint, and that's one of the things that I don't think is always taught in religious settings, is that we teach whatever religious text that we're using, we teach it as concrete and all-knowing, instead of understanding when it was written and by whom it was written and how that applies to today, because people today are not the same that they were centuries ago. You know, the things that we have available, the socialization that we experience, those things change. So therefore, you use it, or at least the way that I've learned to do, I've learned to use that as a guide to how I understand and am able to critically think through different situations. But I always remember that I will treat my neighbor as I would treat myself. The thing is, I don't get to choose who my neighbor is. You know, I don't get to choose that person. I just have to love them the same way that I love myself. And I also will not go in, you know, sort of pushing my religious beliefs onto others. If someone believes something differently from the way that I believe, if I care, I will talk to them about how they understand the world and why they believe the world to be the way that it operates. You know, I think that that's the exact same way that I was taught from my very religious family and my great grandmother, my grandmother. You know, if you treat the world with love, the world will change. You know, the world around you will change. You will change that world, but that world will also change you in a way as well. Not going in to force people to think about something in a certain way, but to talk to them and understand that both of our methods and our ways of seeing are different. However, they may have similarities in them. Or who knows, maybe in talking to you about the way that you understand the world and how it operates, I might change my own perspective, right? But I didn't go in fighting you on it. I just went in to understand how you saw it, and then we took that conversation and expanded and went beyond that. So I think I hit all of the questions that you sent. I tried my best to do that. Any questions or thoughts that have popped up in your head since I've been talking so far? None? Everything's been clear. Everybody feel good about it so far?
So I'm just curious about like you've taught in Georgia and Louisiana and Arizona. I mean, what are some of the things that you find similar across those experiences in terms of your students, or even the things that you've had to face as a teacher, and maybe the things that are different? I know that's a big question, but
Oh no, it's good. So I taught in high schoolers before. I taught in Georgia, Louisiana, Georgia, Arizona, Pennsylvania. I was moving around a lot. This is probably the most stationary that I've been over the years, but teaching in all of these different places, one of the things that I would say is that students still come to me eagerly. You know, I don't mean that they flood into sociological classes. That is far from the truth. But when they're in there, the students that are in there, they find themselves motivated and intrigued and really, really love the information that they are learning at that time. I will say teaching at the different levels. Right now I'm teaching at the community college level. Before I taught at the university level before moving here. And I did teach at community college in Louisiana too, Baton Rouge Community College for 2.5 years there. I will say that in these different experiences, faculty and administration is different depending on the levels that you're, where you're teaching. And I will say that I taught I went to school at a PWI, which is a predominantly white institution, because I realized a long time ago that there were things that were missing in minority communities. Right now, I teach at an HSI, a Hispanic serving institution. So a huge portion of my student population here are Latinos. And I taught at an HBCU prior to coming here, which most of the students there were Black students. But what you find on the faculty and administrative side is that most of the faculty and administration are white. That is not a bad thing, but it is a result of our long history of not having minorities being able to access education. And most of those beyond K-12 are also male, because we've had a long history of not allowing women education until 50, 60 years ago that they started going in and now flooding the classrooms, where women are typically outnumbering males in classrooms. So the student body populations, you can see the remnants of our history. But I also think that that's a beautiful thing, but only if we talk about it. You know, most of us are scared to talk about these uncomfortable things. And I grew up in a family where they made me comfortable with the uncomfortable. You know, you get over whatever it is, because the only way to get through those situations is to communicate about it and learn about it. But you cannot exclude people from the conversation, especially if the people you're trying to exclude from the conversation are the people that you say are the problem. How will they understand what that problem is if you never talk to them? You know, how will they understand your perspective if you don't talk to them, if you don't attempt to talk to them? So each one of these places have been different in its own way, but still similar. I will say, and I tell my family this, that Arizona is probably the most racist place that I've ever lived in my life, and I'm from Louisiana. Not that that doesn't speak great volumes, but it's a place where I will say that people in Louisiana are used to Black people being around. At least in Southeast Louisiana, where I grew up, you know, they're used to seeing people who look like me, so therefore their interactions are different. But coming out West, you'd see people not necessarily intentionally always doing things, but doing things that they didn't even know were problems, you know? So, but I have people used to saying or doing bold things here. You know, this is the first place that I ever tried, anyone ever tried to have me put out of a library. And that was interesting. That was a tough situation. But even in that situation, at the end of the day, there's a lady that walked over to me and she said, "I'm sorry that you had to go through that." I appreciated her saying that. But what she probably didn't notice was that while you come and speak to me afterwards, you did nothing to help stop that situation in the moment. That complicity in that moment says that this is okay to do in a public space. You know, not speaking up because you're going to stand out too. You know, I was in a small library where I'm the only dark-skinned person in that room, and no one says anything. You know, I have to get the librarians to come and please help for this to stop, and everybody can hear. You know, while I appreciate that afterwards, during that moment, it would have been a moment to help ease the tension and to stop the behavior from happening. You know, but those are things that people wouldn't even notice that create an atmosphere of saying this is okay for this to happen. You know, it's not me, it's that person who's doing it. I'm not the racist because I'm not doing that to that person, but you're also allowing that other person to do it. I don't have the power to stop this person in this moment, but you may say something that they could hear differently from the way that they're hearing it from me because they don't want to hear it at all. You know, having moments like that or pointing out moments like that while I am teaching a class or, you know, while I am training other teachers, those are moments where people start to say, "Oh, I didn't realize that me not saying something was contributing to that atmosphere." You know, I would find that it's harder here than it would be in the Southeast to do those kinds of things in the classroom because in the Southeast, people are more used to seeing Black bodies. You know, of course, that's based on our own racist history of slavery, but the idea is that they see us, so therefore their interactions with us change because they see us more as human, at least because we're more frequently around. Here, not so much, because there are not many at all. As I told you, I'm the only Black person in my department, and many times the only one in my classroom. You know, so I don't know if that actually answered your question, Thomas, but I was trying to get to it. Anyone else? Or Thomas, if you have another one. I did want to sort of give a more concrete answer to the question of what can churches do. I guess in that long discussion of talking about religion, I didn't mention that. I mentioned that churches teach that whatever their religious text is, it is the end all, instead of contextualizing and letting people understand that it is a guide for how to live, but not maybe not necessarily the end of the discussion. And when people say, oh, well, this is the word of God, make sure that you understand that it is a conversation between God and humans. So you have to decipher what is the language of God versus what is the language of the humans that are written into this text, and understand that in a conversation, there are going to be differences on thought. So who's thinking what, and how do you interpret that? Because even the scripture that you all just read, where God asked, what is your interpretation of loving thy neighbor? Who is the good Samaritan? It was based on that person's interpretation of that situation. You know, so I would think that churches and other religious institutions could ensure that congregations could know things like that, because what it doesn't create this dichotomous answers, this black and white, either you're with us or you're with them kind of mentality, but it lets us know that there is a gray area. And if we actually talk to people, fully understand it, then we would know that it's not the text that we might be looking at may not be, our interpretation may not be the end all interpretation, because someone else's interpretation may be very, very different. Or how does our interpretation apply to this situation? Or even why do we interpret it that way? Any other questions or thoughts?
So can you share a story or a scenario where, or maybe two, where you really felt like you enlightened or, opened the minds of, some students, and then another scenario where you just found it totally closed?
Yes. Okay, so teaching at a college, very different from teaching at a university, because at a college, I don't have as much time. All I have many times is one semester with a student, two, if I'm really, really lucky, I get to keep them for another semester, because in the colleges, you teach monotonous classes. That means that you're gonna teach the same class over and over, typically year after year, semester after semester. At the universities, you might teach all different classes in one semester, and the next semester you might have a different set of classes. So I was able to have students for years at a time, as opposed to one semester at a time. So it was easier to reach students in the university than in a college setting. I have to take a different approach. So, and I'll talk about instances from both of those situations. One of my favorite students was when I was in Georgia, and her name was Desiree, which I haven't talked to Desiree in a long time, but I'll tell you about Desiree. Desiree grew up in right outside of Clayton County, just south of Atlanta, and she never was the kind of student to receive really good grades or anything like that until she was in my class. She got good grades, and she was very shocked at it. And one day I gave her a dictionary for Christmas. I remember getting out for Christmas break, and I gave her a dictionary. And she is like, thank you. She was so happy just to receive the dictionary. She told me that I was her first professor, that a first person in her life to ever tell her she was smart. And she took classes with me for an entire year before that time. And then the next year, she took my classes. So every semester, basically, that I was in that school, she was with me, you know. But she said that I was the first person to teach her that or tell her that she was smart. And that motivated her to keep taking my classes. That motivated her to go into sociology. She was not the most well-read student, so therefore she couldn't spell well. I understood that by reading her papers. I was like, okay, so she needs help with grammar and everything. But when she spoke in the classroom, I could tell that she understood what she was learning in that classroom. She had a little trouble reading, but what she couldn't figure out through reading, she figured out through videos, because I sent her some videos when she asked for help. I said, look at these videos. They cover each one of your chapters in your book. Your book has videos as well, but I mentioned that because it was one of the times that I felt most proud as a teacher, when she came and said, nobody's ever thought she was smart. And I told her, I said, you're smart, you're very intelligent. You just have trouble spelling. You just have trouble reading. You have to work on those skills. But I know that conceptually you understand everything that is happening in my class, which is why you continue to pass my class with a B. I said, when we're gonna get you to that A, when I can get your writing up, when I can get you to that point. And when I left the school, I was only there for 2 years before I moved back to Louisiana, because my mom wasn't doing well at that time. She came to me and she was upset and she was crying because I was leaving. And she said she didn't feel like any of her other teachers were going to treat her the same way. I said, well, you don't need them to treat you the same way. You know about yourself now. You know what you need to do. You know what you need to work on. You go and work on those things and you will be successful no matter what class that you're in. I know she finished school, but I have not spoken to her since that time, because I know she's moved on. But I talked to my department chair about her, and she told me that she had moved on, but she finished, But I had a few students like that in Georgia where they did not. Georgia to me was one of on the lower end of the education spectrum. So I had a lot of students that were not prepared for college by the time that they got there. But I appreciated that I could still try to push those students. Here in Arizona, teaching at the community college level, I only get a student for a shorter period of time. And I also usually get students who are also not prepared for college, but even less prepared for college, typically at a community college. Not all of them are like that, but many of them are taking like remedial reading classes and things like that. What I've had to do was change my approach to teaching and the assignments. I would usually have more written assignments in my classes. Now, I also went to the Rand Institute in Santa Monica, California, to learn how to talk about public policies and how laws change. One of the things that I learned is that many times we think we have to do these amazing things to change the world around us. And what they taught me there was that you could just start where you are. You start with the things that you do, the things that you can do well. And consciousness raising is a very, very important aspect of that, is that we can bring attention to things that people may not have even thought about. And that will help hopefully spark a world of change. So one of the assignments that I have now that I keep as a mainstay, which I also got a grant here to do at the school for an entire academic year, was to combine my social science classes with art classes that included dance and visual arts. So what I did was create an assignment that didn't require a ton of writing, but it allowed students to use artistic methods to convey a social message. And we were able to put that on display for the school. We did a show that also included the works of the students in the classroom. So the main idea behind that is for my students to understand that sociologists aren't just writers. They think that we just write and we do boring things. No, we do a ton of other things. We are artists. We are all sorts of all sorts of people that are included in here. So, but I wanted them to know you can bring a message to people through the arts. You don't have to just write. If you're a musician, you can write songs about social change or about social issues. If you're a visual artist, you can paint photos that depict images and messages. You can write, you can make music about it. You can do all sorts of things. So the bottom line is that I've used that project, and I've had students present their works at the student success conferences that we have here. And last year I had one that won first prize, which was $1,000, which he was very, very happy. And I was very excited for him. His parents were like, we can't believe that you got him to shut up. I said, well, he doesn't really shut up. I just taught him how to change the way that he spoke so that it was more interesting. So, you just find ways of helping students sort of reframe how they see the world and how they talk about it, because then people might listen. And that's what we did. So I hope that gave you two different ways of me seeing the change in students. Any others? None? Well, I'm at least hopeful that everything is clear. I will say that one of the questions that you all gave me was, what is one of the joys, which I just talked about. Thank you, Sissy, for reminding me about that. But the hard parts of this job. The hard parts of doing what I do is that it can be emotionally taxing. It can be emotionally taxing to where you want to give up on doing it, because it's a constant, you get constant reminders every single day. And even what our culture is going through right now is a huge reminder that there's so much more that we still need to do. We have silent or calm moments, but those moments are very light moments until we step on a landmine, and then poof, we're back here again. So seeing all of these things happen, and hearing, even every semester when I get new students that are talking or hearing me talk about these things, it is a constant reminder that we may never get to the point during my lifetime to where everything is completely comfortable and happy for everyone. I continue to see people, I guess I'll put it this way. I teach my students that as I get older, I began to realize how simple our human mind is. It is complex. However, we relate in very, very simple and superficial ways, and they're like, well, what does that mean? I said, well, if you realize on social media, you have people who are called influencers. I asked them, do they make their own decisions? They say, yes, we make our own decisions. I said, well, why do you do some of the things that you do? Do you ever do things because your friends do them, or because you saw someone else do them, or you have trends here and there? Where do those trends come from? If we were all critical thinkers and self-sufficient in the way that we thought, no one would be able to just influence us to do certain things. And sometimes we do the wrong things for the right reasons, and that can definitely happen all the time. I tell them advertising wouldn't work if our minds weren't simple. Advertisers, they depend on us to feel like we need this thing. They depend on us to feel like we're left out of something. Religion works the same way, and it has worked that way for a long time. So it has a parallel to the way that our society has worked, And I'm not saying people who are critical thinkers are non-religious. There are plenty of critical thinkers that are very, very religious, or spiritual. I would say that about myself. I don't practice or go to religious services in the same manner as I used to. Since I've moved here to Arizona, I go less, but I still have a connection to a higher power, and I still use that connection to remind me that I always have to treat people with kindness and the respect that I want them to treat me with. So I use religion to sort of as a reminder to be kind to people all the time. But seeing that simplicity come out in people is hard. I wish that we did have free education. I wish that we did teach critical thinking earlier in schools. I wish that we taught civil dialogue or discourse earlier in schools, because higher education is expensive. You know, we have scholarships and everything that are there, but it's still expensive for people to try to afford to go to college. But because of that, most of our nation does not get a college education, you know, and I feel like that's a sad thing because they miss out on what education brings to you. And that is a different way of thinking about the world, not based on what's taught in the book, but based on being in a classroom that you don't get to choose who's in that classroom with you. You sign up for the class, and somebody else who thinks totally different from you will show up in that class, and hopefully they will voice their opinion, which might be different from yours, which might create a moment of, wait a minute, I never thought about it that way. Maybe I need to change the way I think about something, you know, but most people are not getting that here in this culture. We are getting our traditional ways of thinking, and then we're going out in the world of work because our economy has created us. We have trouble paying for school, but we also need to work to survive. We need to eat. We have children. We have families. We have all of these things that we miss out on. So that's the hard part of the job, is that you continue to see this, not just with your students, but just seeing it in our everyday life, looking at the news, all the things that people are doing to one another. And I feel like they're helpless to see anything different because they have not been taught anything different, or they have not been exposed to being in a situation where people might think differently. So that's the hardest part of this. And I would say that if I could go back to school before knowing all this stuff, I don't think I'd be a sociologist. I love what I do, but at the same time, it's hard. It's emotionally taxing to see, you know, I struggle even enjoying television. I don't watch a ton of it. I typically watch television with other people, not really something I sit around and watch myself, you know. I watch it with others. So you have to be emotionally strong in order to do this, you know. But what keeps me emotionally strong is having faith. And I specifically use the word faith because faith is not rational for me. Faith is it's a hope that something's going to occur, even though I don't see it happening now. So I'm hoping that in the future things will be better for the people that come after me, even if it doesn't happen during my lifetime. Hopefully I'll be able to contribute some small part of that being better for like my nieces and nephews and, you know, children that will be here later. So that's my story. Hopefully I didn't bore you all.
No, thanks so much, LeBron. This was great. It really dovetails in with what we've been doing with our reading and stuff. And thanks for taking the time to share with us. And we're gonna let you go.
Okay.
And we're gonna take a little break. But again, thanks,
Give him a
LeBron.
hand.
Thank you.
Thank you all. I will say at the end of the day, if I leave you with nothing else, just know that even though this work is hard work, it's not impossible. So please continue to do it.
Thank you.
Thank you,
See you all
LeBron. You
later.
were wonderful.
Thank you.
Thanks.
See y'all later.
So y'all want to take a little break? We'll just a real small one, like be back in like 4 minutes, maybe. Okay, great. 3:25.